So I will just briefly introduce the jury and then give the floor to Baptiste Andrieu, who will defend his PhD today. So Baptiste, you have a beautiful jury today with transdisciplinarity that reflect well your research. Harald Sverdrup from Norway, who is one of your reviewers, together with Nicolas Gourdin from Supérieure Toulouse. And then you have three examinators, Valérie Dacremont from Lausanne, and Aude Pommeret from Chambéry, and myself from University Grenoble-Alpes. And then your two supervisors, Olivier Vidal, who is here on the table, and Gaël Giraud, who is online. And I don't know if Maxime Efoui-Hess is here. Oh, yeah, good to see you. Who is invited, working for the Shift project. And then I hope that I do not miss anyone. No, I think. So, Baptiste, the floor is yours for 45 minutes.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for being here, and especially thank you very much to all the jury members for accepting to take part in this jury. My PhD thesis is funded by the Shift project. The Shift project is a think tank advocating the shift towards a post-carbon economy. I'll first start by a few words about the global context in which this thesis takes place, and at the end of this introduction, I'll present the overall structure of the thesis. So the overall context is that of the Great Acceleration. During the last 70 years, we've seen an exponential increase in a number of indicators, among which gross domestic product, GDP, which is representative of economic growth. This exponential increase in economic growth has been enabled by the availability in our environment of energy and resources. In particular, energy allows us to extract resources from the environment and turn them into things that are useful for us humans. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to, this was working just a minute ago. Okay, so I'll just use my computer. Okay, sorry about this. On this graph, you see the increase in the global raw materials used in the existing stocks over time. What I mean here by existing stock is any good or infrastructure that has a lifetime of more than a year. And so we see here concrete, aggregates, bricks, asphalt, metals, etc. And sorry, went too fast. And in 2020, the overall human-made mass passed above the global biomass weight on Earth, the dry weight. The buildings and infrastructure weigh more than trees and shrubs, and the plastics weigh more than animals. These total stocks are central both for environmental impacts and for human welfare. For environmental impacts, here, let's take into, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. We see here the historical greenhouse gas emissions in black, then what would happen with the implemented policies in red, and the changes in slope for both limiting warming to 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Why are stocks central for this? Well, because we emit greenhouse gases to produce them, but also we then also have what we call lock-in effects, for which during the whole lifetime of an infrastructure, we'll need energy to make it function and thus emits CO2 again. And then stocks are also central for economic growth. Think houses, schools, hospitals, transport equipment, etc. we see here the historical increase of the global GDP between 1980 and 2020, and then the huge increase in GDP for a number of different scenarios used in the IPCC. So stocks are central both for environmental impact and for the economy. And in the future, since we want these huge changes in slope, it's important to put into model the interactions between economy, stocks, and environmental impacts. Stocks have been studied a lot, and this is enabled especially by material flow analysis, for which we take a system and we look at the resources and energy needed to produce this stock, and then study the waste and recycling, etc. This can be done for a specific product over time, or for several products at the same time, but it's not a systemic approach. It's specified, it's for products specifically. Then we have other kinds of models that are way more systemic. This is the case, for example, for integrated assessment models. Integrated assessment models are complex numerical simulations representing the links between the socio-environmental impacts on the one hand and the economy on the other hand. I mean, the economy and the natural system. Sorry, that was not clear. This is the example of the different boxes in the message IX model. The goal of this figure is not to really read it, but just to see that there are different blocks connected: land use, pollution, energy and economy, etc. However, in these models, there are not any stocks. And this can lead to major stocks of infrastructures as I presented before. And this can lead to inconsistencies. For example, if every sector's energy demand is calculated by economic assumptions. And for example, the energy needed by the industry sector is not calculated endogenously so that it allows to produce all of the stocks needed in the model. And so this forms the research gap. It's important to have integrated assessment models that are as systemic as the ones existing today, but it's also central for them to have at their core a stock and flow consistent analysis. Based on this, the aim of the PhD was to better understand the energy, raw materials, GDP service nexus by the construction of a multi-regional stock and flow consistent model of worldwide infrastructures with regionalized impacts. So this aim is very ambitious, and fortunately, I was not alone working on this. We were a team of 4 researchers, and especially 3 PhD students here in Terre. So we each set different research objectives for all of the theses to be complementary. My first research objective was thus to contribute to the development of the Matter model. Matter is the name of the model we're building for multi-regional assessment of technologies, energy, and resources. And in this, my specific role was to focus on the transport sector. Then we want the model to be able to do backcasting, so to start a long time in the past and to go study the future. So we can start the model in the 1900s and then go until 2050 or as far in the future as we would like, as long as it makes sense. And to do this, it's very important to take into account technological progress because the technologies change very rapidly over time. At the same time, the resources available in our environment also change and decrease in quality because we start by taking the good resources and then the ones remaining are of less quality. The second objective of my thesis was just to study the contribution of technological progress and resource dilution on the energy intensity and especially on the energy intensity of metals production. Then I said that we wanted the model to be multi-regional because the demands will be different in every region, but also because not every region produces what it's consuming in the end. So the third objective was to regionalize the impacts of production and consumption in the Matter model using input-output analysis. Finally, historically, some sectors have been studied a lot. This is the case in these kind of models. This is the case, for example, for the building sector, for the transport sector, for the energy sector. Why have they been studied so much? Well, mostly because they are the ones that emit the most CO2, but also because they are the ones that are the easiest to model. If we think of transport, then we can count number of cars, number of trains, kilometers of roads, and we can also count square meters of buildings and number of wind turbines. If now we think of healthcare, what people want from healthcare system is to be healthy. And that's much harder to model than just saying, okay, I want a house. And so the last objective of this thesis was to explore the energy resources health nexus and to try to think of whether or not it would be possible to put this sector in our model. So based on this, if I summarize what my contributions were to the overall team, it was especially to focus on the transport sector, to use input-output analysis for technological progress and the impact, and also to study healthcare. The structure of this presentation is the same as that of the overall thesis. We are now at the end of the introduction, and I'll present 4 chapters, each responding to a research objective, and a conclusion in the end. Chapter 2 is thus the presentation of the matter model, which we are building here in Terre. We have 3 different ways we can enter into the model, represented here by these hexagons. Each time you'll see hexagons on the figure, it will mean that it's input parameters. The first way to enter into the model is by socioeconomic parameters, for example, gross domestic product and population. And we'll transform this into stocks of end-use sectors. So say, for a given amount of GDP, it will represent this amount of cars, this amount of buildings, etc. Second option is to enter by energy. And these would be energy scenarios, saying we'll use this amount of energy in the transport sector, this amount in the building sector. So this is a way of post-processing other people's scenario in order to analyze them in terms of stocks and flows. And finally, we can also enter into the model by services, saying what people want in the end is not to have this amount of one stock, but to be able to go from home to work every day and to travel and to have a house, etc. So we'll transform each one of these, so each option, into end-use sectors, which are the stocks. And then what we're interested in is not just the stocks for themselves, but all of the flows that are associated with the stock. So we'll have an accounting box in the model that will take into account input parameters here in red, such as the characteristics of the infrastructure, the resources intensities, energy intensities, emission intensities. And the outputs of this accounting box will be impacts such as greenhouse gases, infrastructure flow. If here we have a stock of cars, then this will be the number of cars that we need to build every year, the resources, so the amount of steel needed for these cars, the energy needed to build them, and the power demand. But then let's say here, I have a car and I say, well, we need copper to produce this car. But then we also need the infrastructure needed to produce this flow of copper. And so we have a second round of accounting to here have access to the stocks of manufacturing industry, resource supply industry, energy supply industry, power supply industry. Here again, taking into account input parameters. Let's take an example, and then we'll have iterations until reaching an equilibrium. Let's take an example, and we'll go back to saying, okay, we want a car here as a stock. We'll have the accounting that will tell us, well, for this, you need electricity to build the car. And for electricity, we'll need here a wind turbine. And this accounting box will tell us, well, to produce the wind turbine, you also need electricity. And so you need a little more of a wind turbine. And we'll iterate until reaching the equilibrium. I will now give an example of the way we enter into the model by socioeconomic parameters, the example of GDP per capita. So we want to go from GDP per capita to stocks. And what we observe is that historically, the stocks of infrastructures per capita have followed logistic curves. Logistic curves are S-shaped curves for which at the beginning of the curve where people have 0 GDP per capita. So here, sorry, you'll see infrastructure per capita as a function of GDP per capita. At the beginning of the curve, people are really poor and there is no infrastructure in that country. And as people get richer, there is an exponential deployment of infrastructure until ultimately reaching saturation. The saturation makes sense for cars, for example. No one can drive 2 cars at once. So once everyone who wants a car has one, the cars we need are those that are required to maintain the stocks or replace the ones at the end of their lives. And then we can discuss the saturation levels for other infrastructures, but it makes sense that there will always be a saturation level, but perhaps we'll invent other kinds of stocks later. Right. So for us, this, in terms of business as usual scenarios, this approach makes sense. We know that if we don't make any efforts to to change from cars to bikes, we will have this kind of curves. And we can put them in equations. So this is the overall structure of the logistic curve, gamma the saturation, theta the slope of the curve, y here the GDP. And then what we're interested in is to have a single equation with which we can describe the stocks for every region of the world, even when we don't have data. And that way we can also be predictive for when we don't have data. And then we know that there will be differences in between countries and that the curve will not fit perfectly. And so we try to adjust parameters in between countries, but by explaining them. For example, we'll say the saturation level gamma will be somewhat dependent to population density. And we can try to go further and further in these deployments, but always having a single equation. This is not what's done in most models, which are for integrated assessment models. The demands are almost always based on elasticities. And I'll here give the example of how the GCAM model works. So the GCAM is an integrated assessment model made by an American team that has a lot of influence in IPCC reports. And their equations look like this. So we have a demand for passenger kilometers, which is the number of passengers doing 1 kilometer every year. It will depend on 3 parameters: GDP, population, and price, with elasticities. So if GDP and population increases, the demand will increase, and if the price increases, the demand will decrease. However, we have always here a sigma R parameters that allows them to set initial conditions. And so they will have, in the end, a different equation for each of the region because they have different initial conditions. And they're not explaining it like we are trying to do. And then once they have this demand in passenger kilometers, to choose which modal share will be used for these parameters, for these passenger kilometers, sorry, we again have elasticities with price and a constant. And we'll show what this kind of approach, the difference in these two approaches, what the results can be. So we took the GDP trajectories from the SSP2 model scenario, which is a business as usual scenario used in IPCC reports. Here, so we've done it for every region of the world, but for the sake of clarity, we chose 3 here. I chose 3 here. That's with different levels of GDP. So the European Union, 15 regions of the European Union, Colombia, and China. We see here vehicles per capita as a function of time. The black line, so here, here, and here, representing historical data. Then, from the equations I showed before, and the trajectories of GDP from the SSP2, we obtain the logistic curve in blue, here, here, and here. And then we compare these results with what is obtained with the elasticities approach of the GCAM model. And this is the colored curves we see here, here, and here. And the difference in colors are the different CO2 emission pathways of this business as usual scenario. So what we see is that we always reach a saturation in the logistic approach. We reach it because there is an important economic growth in each of these models. So we say for this level of economic growth, we will reach the saturation. However, there is a close to linear increase for the GCAM model every time, except for China, where the stocks, of course, are very, very low. So first we see that this is over our saturation level. This is very low. And this is 2 times lower than the historical data of Chinese cars. And this is very surprising because here, in 2100, there will be in China $77,000 per capita. I mean, this is their scenario, which is twice as much as the GDP per capita today in France. And at this level of GDP per capita, in the JCAM, they say, well, there won't be any cars. So where does this thing come from? Well, it's from the equation of the modal shares in between modal shares. Sorry. So let's take the example of buses and cars. I showed before the equation giving us the passenger kilometers of the overall transport sector. And then price dynamics will allow for these parameters to change over time. This is represented here for the USA and China. The cars are the share of the total passenger kilometers made by car are in orange and by bus in blue. As at the x-axis here, we see the GDP per capita. So what's happening here is that at the beginning of the model, in the USA, 95% of the passenger kilometers are done by car, and this stays fairly the same over time. However, for China, it's around 15%. It increases a little, but not much, until 20%. Why does this happen? Well, because they force different initial conditions here without explaining them. So they say, well, Chinese people perhaps prefer using the bus rather than taking the car. But it's not what's happening. The reason why they take the bus here is because they have $2,000 per capita and they don't have the money to buy a car. And what can change the dynamic here is only if the relative price of cars versus buses changes. And in real life, what's happening is that people buy cars when their personal income increases. And so I'm not saying elasticities are necessarily bad. We use them also sometimes for some small parts of the model, but using them blindly can lead to huge inconsistencies between, well, the model and what's likely to happen. Especially in the business as usual scenarios, if we compare our two approaches, we obtain in the end 15 billion cars of difference for the 80 years between 2020 and 2100. And this has huge impacts on the overall greenhouse gases in these scenarios, which are then central for the IPCC reports. I spent a lot of time presenting this, and it's not just to say that the GCAM model is bad. I don't think it is. And as a matter of fact, we use it only because it is open access and it has great documentation. And so I think overall it's a good model. However, it's to say that it is central to have equations that allow us to describe stocks precisely, and that these equations need to be consistent with historical data, and they also need to be predictive so that we can use them when we don't have data. Right. So coming back to this figure, I showed here how from socioeconomic parameters we then obtain end-use sectors, in this example, cars. I showed it for cars, but we can do it for every infrastructure. And in the end, here have, for example, resource flows, so the impacts. This result is shown here for concrete and steel as a function of time. What we see is that we reach a saturation in the overall global demand of concrete and steel in a business as usual scenario. This makes sense. If we have a saturation for each technology, then in the end, we'll also have a saturation for the overall demand. We also see that for China, we are at the peak or close to the peak in terms of raw materials demand. Makes sense because they have built their infrastructure very fast in the last 20 years, and they can't keep building it forever. And then here we see new markets arising, such as Africa, India, and developing Asia here. And the modeler can change the assumptions. The modeler can try to see what happens if Africa's GDP per capita grows faster or slower than this. So we're not saying this is what's going to happen. We say in a business as usual scenario, with these trajectories of GDP, this is what's likely to happen.
Baptiste. Normal.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So in the last chapter, I presented the overall structure of the model. This model works from 1900 to today and then in the future. And so we need to calibrate technological progress. So in the model, this will be a calibration of this parameter here, energy intensities. I will focus on primary copper production. So we have two types of copper in the model, recycling and primary, of course, but we'll always need primary. I mean, for now, since we are in a phase of growth, what can be recycled is only what was built 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or whatever the lifetime of the infrastructure is. And so we'll still need primary production. Historically, we have started by exploiting copper mines of very good quality. Here we see the copper ore grade as a function of time, with here an overall mean. And as time dies, the concentration of copper mines decreases because we start by taking what's easily available. Now, let's try to think about what the minimal energy is to extract a kilogram of copper. Well, it is necessarily proportional to the amount of rocks we have to extract from the environment. And so if the concentration decreases, then the minimal energy that we need to produce a kilogram of copper will increase. This is represented here schematically as the red curve, showing that the historical thermodynamic limit has increased. Now, let's see what actually happened. It is represented here as the green curve, the historical energy intensity to produce 1 kilogram of copper. What we see is that in the 1900s, we had very good resources quality. So we needed very little energy, but we had very bad technology. And so even though the thermodynamic limit was very low, we used a lot of energy. And the difference between these two is the orange curve here, which represents the inefficiencies of technology. And as time went by, well, the thermodynamic limit increased, but the inefficiencies decreased, and they decreased faster than the increase in thermodynamic limit, which allowed the overall energy intensity to decrease. However, in the future, the thermodynamic limit will keep increasing, and even if the technological inefficiencies reach zero, since the green curve here can only reach the red curve asymptotically and cannot go under, there will come a time, and we think that it is about now or in the next decade for copper, where the energy needed to extract copper will start increasing again. And this is also the case for a number of other metals. So here we can put in equation both historical energy intensity as a function of technology and resource quality. But this is just an example. And we need to do so at the scale of the whole economy and not just for the end use of raw materials. And we also need to do it for every region in the model. Here, we have to think that a lot of models are happening in parallel, and I'll come back to this later in the next chapter about how we link the flows in between regions. So how can we differentiate energy intensities for different regions? Well, here I use input-output analysis. What is input-output analysis? It's a tool that, so it's built by different research teams around the world, and that represents in one big matrix the economic exchanges in between every region of the world and every sector, so every industry of every region. Here's how we read it. Let's take the region. So the one I use is Exio-based. It has 49 regions, 200 products. Let's take here region 1, say it's France, and product 2 is material equipment. The way we read this matrix is that a column will give everything that is bought by companies producing transport equipment in France from every other industry of every other country. And then one line will give us who this transport equipment is sold to. And in the end, it is also sold to final consumers here represented in the Y matrix. And then the whole strength of input-output analysis is that with a simple mathematical calculation of the Leontief inverse of a matrix, we can say for €1 of final demand in a given region, everything that we needed to produce along the whole value chain to, in the end, get this euro of final demand. And then we have what we call environmental extensions, which give us, for every unit of intermediate consumption produced, what the environmental impacts were. And so by multiplying both vectors, we get the final footprint of, for example, transport equipment in France. And this is how we calculate energy footprints. I thus calculated the overall energy intensity of final consumption in the 49 regions of ExIOBase in the year 2017, and tried to look at what it looked like as a function of GDP per capita. And we find that there is a small positive correlation between the overall energy intensity of final consumption and GDP per capita. This is surprising because we first think that richer regions are more efficient than less rich regions. And what's happening here is that as people get richer, there is a shift in the type of goods that they buy, and they actually tend to buy more of transport services, which is more energy intensive. And so overall, the energy intensity increases a little. So this is one dynamic that's happening. And at the same time, we know that there is also a dynamic of technological progress. This is shown here for the energy intensity of the world in between 1990 and 2013, going from 8 megajoules per 2017 US dollars to 6. So every year, the overall economy becomes more efficient. And so I tried to see if we have this same relationship for every year. And this is what I obtained for the last 15 years. We always find this small positive correlation. And what's happening is that every year, the overall regression line is lower than the previous year. Here is the energy intensity as a function of GDP per capita. All of the lines we see from 2003 to 2017. So two dynamics at the same time. As people get richer, they change the types of goods that they buy, but everybody becomes more efficient over time. And so based on these two components, I thought it would be interesting to put them in equation with the same types of equation than for the energy needed to produce metals. However, to do so, we would need to have thermodynamic limits. And we don't know the thermodynamic limits of the overall economy. Unfortunately, some researchers at the University of Leeds are working on modifying these input-output databases and adding environmental extensions of useful energy, so the minimal energy we need at every step of the production process. And this is still work in progress, but once they will have completed this, I'll come back to this and try to see if we can find or not the same dynamic. So this is exploratory because the regression coefficients here are quite small, but it could be interesting to see what's happening. So in the last chapter, I showed how we try to regionalize energy intensities and to take into account both technological progress and changes in resource quality. I'll now talk about how I regionalize the impacts in the matter model. First of all, why is it important to have regionalized impacts? Well, to have a regionalized model, first of all. Here we see the overall crude steel consumption in the world between 1950 and 2020. We see an important increase between 1950 and 1970. And then here, a saturation or a slower growth, and then a huge increase in the overall consumption. And to understand what's happening here, we need to have different regions. Otherwise, it's just impossible to explain. And what's happening here is a deployment of infrastructure in the global north, then a saturation, and then the arrival of China in the global market. This is shown here. The same crude steel consumption between 1965 and 2020. We see that some markets have not changed, Europe, US, Russia, and then the huge increase of the overall Chinese demand, now representing half of global production. And we also see that some markets that have the same population as China, such as India, have not yet emerged. And so it is likely that in the next years or decades, we'll have a saturation of China and then a boom of other world regions. To see this, we need a regionalized model, not just in terms of demand, but then also in terms of production. Because before regionalizing the impacts, we had a model that was just regionalized in terms of demand. And this is what it looked like. Let's say we have our in-use stock of cars in France. Then we would say, okay, we need a manufacturing industry to produce these cars from buying steel from a steel market. This steel market being produced by a steel industry, buying iron ore from France. Of course, this doesn't make sense. We have exchanges at every level of the value chain. So I was working on input-output, and I thought it could be interesting to use input-output, data from input-output in order to regionalize this. The challenge being how to keep this stock and flow consistent. But to first, for me, understand how input-output worked, I built here these Sankey diagrams, representing as a case study the greenhouse gas footprints of different world regions, so the 49 exiled between 1995 and 2017. This is represented here for France in 2019. Unfortunately, I would have loved to go into the details of this, but I do not have time. So I'll just show that here we have a first step showing the production-based account, so what's happening on the territory, then the imports, what's happening in terms of consumption, so that's the footprint, and then the exports, and at every step, we can have a different disaggregation. So coming back to how we regionalize this. Well, we'll say the cars from France actually come from different world regions, are produced in different world regions. So to have this, to obtain this result, we take economic information from input-output analysis, which will say, okay, so let's say 20% of the value chain of cars produced in France is taking place in China, 50% in France, and 30% in the rest of the world. So we know that the flows will come this way, and then we can also regionalize, here using only data from the transaction matrix, the two first steps, so who buys, from where the different regions buy their steel, and then from where the different regions buy their iron ore. So we're not using the raw material data from these input-output databases, because sometimes the extensions are bad. I won't enter into the details, but just the economic data, which helps us have something stock and flow consistency in the end. Right, so in the previous parts, I've shown how we go from socioeconomic parameters to end-use sectors, then how we calibrate energy intensities, giving an example of the resource flows, and how we have this model, which is multi-regional in the end. And now we'll take a little of distance from this matter model, and I'll present what analysis I've done for the health environment nexus, which is not in the model yet. And it's a very exploratory work because, as I said before, it's a sector that has been way less studied than others. So the first study I carried out was to see what were the environmental impacts of healthcare systems around the world, with a focus on energy and raw materials, but also we also calculated every other environmental extensions. And here is the results for the energy footprint of various of the 49 systems we have in ExIO-based as a function of the healthcare access and quality index. The healthcare access and quality index is an index that gives us information about the performance of healthcare systems around the world. Here, the different lines represent different regions with different data points from 1995 to 2015. And then the plain dots are the last data points for 2015, the size of the data points being proportional to the population, and the colors being the different regions here. What we see is that, so here I have put the regression line in black for the last year, which shows that there is a positive correlation, an exponential correlation between the energy footprint and the healthcare access and quality index. We find this for every year in the study. However, we also see that in between years, we do not always have this relationship. And there is some kind of decoupling because there are some regions whose energy footprint decreases while their HAQ index increases. And in particular, for a number of systems around an HAQ index of 90, the relationship is less clear than at the beginning. And for all of these systems, their performance is quite close, but we see huge differences in energy intensities, with Switzerland here being at around 15 gigajoules per capita, and Spain being at 3 gigajoules per capita for similar HAQ index. This means there are huge levels of energy efficiencies in between healthcare systems. However, to know more about where these differences come from would require more research, which I have not carried out. So this was the link from healthcare to the environment. But then I wondered also if it was possible to study things the other way around. And here, the whole study will rely on the assumption that energy is a good proxy, so a good short way for lifestyle. Why is this the case? Well, because energy is what allows us to transform the world in which we live, and in the end, to have access to services and goods. And so the more energy we use, the more things we have access to. And so it's logical that we have a positive correlation between human welfare and energy. And this is what researchers have tried to see, plotting here the Human Development Index as a function of the energy footprint. And they first see an exponential increase in the HDI index when energy footprint increases until reaching a saturation. However, the HDI index is a very aggregated index, taking into account health among other indicators. And so I thought it could be interesting to have a specific focus on healthcare, and especially on different diseases in health. So to do so, I used the Global Burden of Diseases database and compared this to energy footprint data from an input-output database. The Global Burden of Diseases gives access to incidence rates of more than 200 diseases around the world between 1995 and 1990 and 2019. Incidence rates represent the number of people who have a given disease divided by the population. And we have two kinds of results. First, so here all of the plots you see are density plots showing the incidence as a function of energy per capita for all the years and all the countries. So the first kind of results are those that show a negative correlation between the two. And these are mostly communicable, so infectious diseases, mostly here. And the second types of results are those showing a positive correlation. And here we'll mostly find non-communicable diseases, with here an example for 15 types of cancers. All of the data we used has been age standardized, meaning that normally, if it has been well done by the people who built the database, the reason why people have more cancer when they have more energy per capita is not because they have not had other diseases when they were younger. So the result is that energy footprint is correlated to low incidence of communicable diseases, but high incidence of non-communicable diseases. We have not shown here any causality, and I don't think it would make much sense to show causality, because it's not just because I use energy to fuel my computer that I will have a cancer. However, it shows something that I find interesting is that people with high energy intensive lifestyles are not necessarily healthier. So overall, they will be healthier, but for some diseases, they have more of these diseases. So this is a possible result. Or the other possible result is that the GBD database is not reliable at all, because when we see this, all of these positive correlations between cancers and energy intensity, we can think that it's just about detection, but in their database, they put uncertainties which are quite low, and so according to them, it's not due to detection. It could be. So assuming it's the first one, and even if it's not the first one, we can try to think about what's happening here in this chapter in the link between energy and healthcare. So it all starts by having access to energy. This energy can be used for doing useful things, such as having access to healthcare, to education, to electricity, prevention, etc. But then some energy use can also be toxic for humans, such as, and these useful energy use will contribute to a decrease of infectious diseases and to a number of diseases in general. However, energy can also be used for things that are toxic to us, such as having a sedentary lifestyle, spending a lot of time in our cars rather than having active modes of transportation, and having also ultra-processed food. This will have potential toxic impacts on the human body, which could in turn produce non-communicable diseases, causing a demand for healthcare systems. So energy needed to fuel these healthcare systems, and this is allowed once again by access to energy. And then by summing all of the different contributions of energy, as well as those that don't have any impacts, either positive or negative, on health, this gives energy footprint per capita. And then this energy footprint will also have impacts on health. For example, if it is produced from energy sources that contribute to pollution and to climate change, since climate change will also have positive or negative impacts on health. To conclude on this chapter before, I thought that it was really interesting to try to understand what's happening in terms of the healthcare sector, but I said at the beginning that it was to potentially put it in the model, and I'm not sure whether or not it's a good idea to put it in the model. I think it would be interesting to put the infrastructures in the model, so in terms of hospitals and any facility that is used for healthcare. However, for the second part, doing all of these interactions, we would have to go into causality analysis, which are, in my sense, impossible to really do well and to fit on reliable data. So I don't think it would be a good idea. To conclude, the first research objective was to contribute to the development of the model. And in this phase, I focused especially on the transport sector and showed that logistic approach for business as usual scenarios. I just turned off my mic. Okay, yes, sorry, I turned off the microphone. I showed that these approaches work better than cost-based approaches in integrated assessment models. Based on this, we have different articles either published or in preparation. The second research objective was to study the links between technological progress and resource quality. I've done this and then carried out an analysis for a multi-regional analysis of overall energy intensities, published an article, and we have another one under review. The third objective was to regionalize the model. First of all, I explored input-output analysis and put all of the results of these Sankey diagrams on an interactive web application, which you can see at sankey.theshiftproject.org. And we have an article under review for this. And then I developed a model to use input-output, which is just economic data, to regionalize the model but having the model that stays stock and flow consistent. And then the last objective was to explore the healthcare energy service nexus. And I've carried out the first assessment of the overall raw materials and energy needed for healthcare systems around the world, published an article about this, and then explored the nexus between energy and health in terms of diseases. And we also have other articles under review. Right, so for future work, I have many ideas about what could be done about this, and I think we all do in the team. The first one would be perhaps to go further into regionalization. So here, now I showed the regionalized impacts for every region of the world, but it could be interesting to have more regional data, for example, using gaze cartography, and this could also allow us to go further into the impact and analysis. Then put some data about exergy or useful energy in the model. This would allow us to fit technological progress rates, as we have done for metals, but for every process in the model. It would also be important to build new narratives, because we most of the time so either we build our narratives for business as usual scenarios with these logistic curves, or use other people's scenarios, which are always based on economic growth. And it would be interesting to have post-growth or degrowth scenarios here. Then coupling it with other models. These models could be biomass models, climate models, which we are, for some of these models, the coupling have started. The strength of having something that is stock and flow consistent for all of these energy and resources is also that we could be able to study vulnerability as a function of complexity and to study risks and crises based on this. I've explored the healthcare system, but other sectors are also unexplored, and so it would be interesting to explore them. And finally, something that would be interesting is to make the model more useful for decision making. And this could be done by adding decision making in the model process. So stopping the model at different time steps and then taking decisions and having different actors take different decisions and see what's happening. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.